Thank you for being so punctual and coming in from the rain and going out in the rain to join us today. And I think I see recognize some familiar faces. I'm Nancy Mosbach. I have the honor of serving as Executive Director of the Yale-China Association. And I think today's conversation is perfectly timed. Tomorrow is the first presidential election, and there are two sections to this book. One is longer than the other one. The first section is what the U.S. can learn from China. And in the epilogue, there is a small section called what China can learn from the U.S. So don't think Anne doesn't have, both ends of this conversation covered. But again, thank you for coming. This is a Fireside Chat series. The first one, I apologize last week if anyone was here. Unfortunately, I came down with that very aggressive virus that went around Greater New Haven and wasn't able to make it. But the format of this event, as you know, is we start promptly at 2:30 or on the half hour, sometimes at 4:30. We'll provide Anne about 15 minutes to share some thoughts. And in this case, since I've heard her speak a number of times and in different formats, provocative at times, but that's intentional to sort of get your mind running. And it's all within the book, which I'm really pleased. It's hard to find your book unless you order directly from the publisher. But we do have 12 copies of the book out there, and Anne has promised that she would sign them. So those of you, run to the back if you want a copy of this wonderful book. But Anne serves in many different capacities as an advisor to a number of different, both private entities and public individuals. She's a senior fellow at Demos, which is affiliated with NYU.
No, they publish the magazine American Prospect.
Oh, published with American Prospect. But she is at NYU as well as a professor. You may have noticed her if you're a frequent watcher of MSNBC or CNN or Fox News. She's a frequent commentator and invited to appear alongside other individuals who tend to disagree with her, and she tends to disagree with. She's written a number of pieces in daily publications, New York Times, FT. She is a contributor to Forbes, so please look out for that as well. And if you can't get enough, there are a number of clips on YouTube that you can also explore some additional insights that Anne has on this very critical bilateral relationship. Educated at Berkeley and at Woodrow Wilson, and then later, just for the heck of it, Harvard Business School for an MBA. So we're really pleased to have Anne here. After the 15 minutes of some remarks made by Anne, we'll open it up for questions. So please, anything goes? Anything goes. Put your thoughts together, and I will lead off with a question and then open it up to the audience. Help yourself to tea and cookies. This is very informal. We are taping it though, because none of the people couldn't make it today, and they would like to hear this talk. So without further ado, Anne, thank you so much for joining us, and we've been looking forward to this, and we look forward to your thoughts. And to start off, you can sit. Please get your questions ready, and actually I have a great one from my colleague Dan Seatman, and I think this is very appropriate on the eve of the presidential election. What would be your elevator pitch about your book and the teachings and the guide, as you describe it, to Middle America?
I would say that
it's an elevator pitch.
Gosh, well, you got tough questions here. Elevator pitch. I would basically say that this is, I would call this a China playbook. This is kind of, sort of China's secret sauce of what made China tick. And just as people would learn from their toughest competitors, or just as companies would learn from their toughest competitors, learning what the other guys are doing right and trying to incorporate it into your own game, why couldn't nations do the same thing?
Perfect. Let me ask one more thing to put in perspective. Anne, you're of Chinese ancestry. I think that helps in this sort of outlook, because when she's referring to, why did you write this book, and what is your the perspective point? How would you self-describe yourself?
I mean, I see myself as an internationalist. I mean, I've lived in China, I've lived here, I've lived in other countries. I pretty much see that people are people, frankly, and people pretty much want the same things, and which is, an opportunity to have a better life for themselves, for their kids. And so I see that there are a lot of common threads here. And then when I read through history, it's pretty much, you know, you see very common threads through different empires as well. And so what I was trying to do is that, okay, oftentimes when things, you know, start to go downhill, you have very ugly situations. And then lots of people talk about American decline. I think it's a little premature, but, you know, it's not impossible if we don't address certain things that are critically not being dealt with correctly. And so I feel that hopefully people, you know, who are of like mind and like spirit of wanting to create a better world for all, that you can learn from lessons from history from other nations and try to avoid the big mistakes. And try to make small reforms because they can have far-ranging effects. And I really do love the U.S. a lot. I mean, I basically say in the prologue that both my parents escaped from China during the Civil War. They were both from very wealthy families. You know, they basically, you know, came here. America was sort of their refuge, and so that was inculcated into me from the very beginning. And so, always had, you know, deep appreciation for the opportunities that were given to me. I mean, in fact, some ways I'm living the American dream. But I worry that that part is getting lost to a lot of the young people coming out of college today, and that would be a real shame because this is a very special nation. And so I pretty much, you know, wanted to raise this issue to people as a way of saying, you know, we don't have to go into decline. Let's try to figure out how to keep it strong.
That's great. That perspective I think is very important. I think we have your name, your affiliation, and preferably one question or one comment for Anne to respond to. Not two questions, not two comments, just one. Okay, Steve.
No, I'm not questioning you.
Steve Alderman, local lawyer.
Sorry. But isn't the way you're talking about functioning basically a dictatorship? I mean, I cannot see the best and the brightest coming out from Yale and saying, gee, I'm going to start working in the lowest part of the local public works department because I can work, instead of going to Wall Street, because if I work in the public works department and stay there for 30 years, I'll learn government. I don't see that happening in anything other than basically a dictatorship.
Thank you, Steve.
No, this isn't a dictatorship. First of all, there are term limits there, and I'm not suggesting that we follow a China model per se. Again, I said, let's figure out how to improve our system, how to align incentives to encourage the best and brightest to work in government to improve governance. We have seen in the last decade how the smartest people were taken away from, you know, going into rocket science or to other areas to go work on Wall Street because the incentives were aligned such that they saw the biggest opportunity. It was the easiest way to make money and make a lot very fast. And
isn't that what that's what you did?
True. And basically, I'm saying that it would be, frankly, a much better system if that weren't the case.
Okay, right here, your name and affiliation, please.
Angela, I'm from the forestry school, master's student. My question is, you talk about the Chinese government functioning more or less as a corporation. So I was wondering, do you think the Chinese government, which is basically an authoritarian regime, more like the political system, more efficient than the political system here in the U.S.?
Well, clearly when you have systems that have more incentives aligned and you have maybe fewer people making the top guidance, like obviously the standing committee has, you know, quite a bit of power, you can have more efficiency. But again, it's, I wouldn't diminish the politics that go on within China. I think the politics are very fierce. You have the princelings on one hand, you have Chuanpeis on the other, and you know, with class divisions, it's always going to be very difficult to find compromise in terms of, you know, capital allocation and resource allocation. So, so it's not necessarily just because it's just top down and a dictatorship. Dictatorship would have been Mao. We don't have that right now, right? This is more or less they're trying to get consensus among lots of people, their collective wisdom. And this is much more difficult, but they have other things they've done to try to align incentives so that they can be more efficient in that sense.
Additional questions, sir? Yeah.
Lei Chen, I'm from the School of Medicine of Chinese Ancestry. Without direct representative democracy, how does the Chinese government reflect the will of the people, especially the minorities? I don't mean ethnic minority necessarily, I mean the minorities who have interests that are trumped by the majority in the interest of efficiency or progress.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like I said, it's not a perfect system, and I'm not advocating a China model by any means. I'm basically saying let's learn best practices, which is a very different message than saying they have it down. I basically am saying I don't think we've invented the perfect system for governing any nation, but there's always room for improvement for any nation. And so, so as far as, you know, trying to incorporate minority voices, I think that, you know, what they're trying to do is incorporate various folks about other backgrounds into the leadership now, right? So in the past, it's all been technocrats. Everyone with, you know, who was an engineer was basically running the show. And now we're going to be seeing, you know, lawyers coming into this next leadership transition. They're inviting entrepreneurs to be part of the central government. And so this is basically, you know, their way of trying to incorporate different voices. And obviously, if someone's not doing a good job, then, you know, that would get reflected in evaluations and so forth. So they would probably not get promoted, you know, over decades if they were clearly, you know, really out of line that way. But again, like I said, I don't think, you know, they've got all the answers to everything. I think they're trying, and when you are steering a country this large, I mean, this is like changing directions of the Titanic. And so there are just gazillion things that happen all the time, and they have to try to keep it all together. Not an easy task.
Additional questions? Yes, please.
I came in a little bit late, excuse me. My name's Tony, I teach in public schools in New Haven. And my question was, and I don't know if this is addressed in your book, the title's What Can the U.S. Learn from China? What can we learn about Chinese education? And if that's not a topic of your book, what do you think is the most important thing that we could learn from China now?
Well, I would say in terms of education, China's education had been criticized for being too rote, for being too, you know, stifling creativity and other things in the past. What I would say makes their educational system seem strong and why they have so many kids coming out of schools is because it's the value system is there. It's basically, it starts from the very foundation of parents caring about education. The parents themselves may not be educated, but they know there's value in it. And so that is a message, a cultural message that needs to be more pervasive in the U.S. And I talk about that in my book because the message we give our young people today is that education doesn't matter, right? You can be rich and famous, just go singing, you know, on American Idol or being a star on Jersey Shore, engaging in very controversial behavior, and you are an overnight star. And you don't have to be educated, right? And I was basically saying we need to figure out a way to change that message. Maybe we give incentives to media companies that, you know, they get tax breaks if they create reality shows around showcasing scientists doing breakthrough research or some other thing to expose young people to these areas that, you know, require more education and making them superstars. Because frankly, when my brother went to MIT, he was involved in this competition, I forget the name of it, but it was sponsored by a Japanese company. And it's almost like the Super Bowl here. So this competition is basically they take teams of young engineers from around the world and they compete with each other by creating these robots of some sort. So what they do is they are each given a box of, you know, junk, like different pieces of stuff. And then they have to, in a certain time period, come up with a contraption that will do something. So in the case of my brothers here, they had to create a contraption that would collect the most tennis balls. So he was pitted, you know, against teams from Germany, from Japan, from everywhere. And these kids were followed around like rock stars by the entire media. And this excited a lot of these Asian kids to go into engineering, right? Because they're the rock stars. And here, you know, we don't have anything like that. And so this is what I'm saying. It is about creating the culture value in education that will make education important.
Thank you.
Yeah, right here. Your name and affiliation?
My name's Aviva Riley, and I'm an affiliated. I was just wondering when you were discussing about how in the United States political positions are often handed out and it's kind of a form of corruption. I was wondering, do you think that having the skilled government in China has prevented corruption within the Chinese government?
Oh, absolutely not. There's corruption that goes on in China all the time. But it happens despite the corruption, and I would say that what they're trying to do is figure out ways to discourage corruption, limit corruption. You're never going to get rid of corruption 100%. And in fact, there's no nation that doesn't have corruption.
Right. But you would see China as having a less, would corruption be less of an issue or just a different type of issue than any?
I would say that what you want is at least the public to believe that this is a system that tries to maintain its integrity, right? If it's too easy for people to see the corruption, then it's obviously going to, you know, create the distrust that is so, you know, that could be so harmful. And clearly, China still has a lot to do to try to combat corruption. And I discussed the various examples in my book of what they try to do, but it is, it's clearly still a problem, but I'm just saying that if we could do that here to try to close the public perception that our government is so corrupt, that could help, right? And maybe, you know, there would be more people that would consider running for office who are very qualified and very, you know, skilled and idealistic, but because they know what goes on in government, they don't want to go anywhere near it, right?
Yes.
I'm Bob Rosenett from the medical school. I had a comment and a question. Just a comment. The reason I think your book would be hard to be grasped by Americans, I've read it and found it compelling but also alienating or unexpected, is I think, at least in my generation, we are imprinted on the Cultural Revolution. In spite of all the changes, you know, we still, when I've been to China many times, and when I'm talking to people, I constantly have the feeling, but I'm expecting the Cultural Revolution, and you know, it's clear that things have changed. So I think that's why we need more contact. My question, which I understand little enough to, but maybe you can clarify, is you talk about the issue of the exchange rates, and that in America we criticize China for rigidly holding its exchange rate, and you sort of turn that around and say that by us maintaining our position as having the reserve currency of the world, you know, we are in fact the ones who are impoverishing the rest of the world, and if they actually did let the currency float, it would be a disaster. I think that's what you say, but I can't say that I understand it, and I wonder if you can try to explain it a little bit better.
No, I'm happy to talk about that because people hear the idea of currency manipulation all the time, and I think it is completely, you know, when people say that, it's kind of like saying, you know, the sky is purple. I mean, like, it's just not true in many ways. What the Chinese are doing when they loosely peg to the US dollar is actually what the whole Allied nations were trying to do in Bretton Woods. Back, you know, right before World War II ended, all the people basically got together at Bretton Woods to try to design a new financial order that would hopefully avoid another world war. They agreed, you know, almost, you know, complete agreement amongst all the 44 nations that the reason why they went to World War was because of currency devaluations, because people were constantly trying to devalue their currencies, and Therefore, cross-border transactions came to a standstill because when currencies do not have stable values, then businesses cannot actually conduct any business because they don't know what their top line is going to be, they don't know what their costs are going to be. You basically bankrupt everyone and you have no economic activity, and then you fall into depression. So the way you prevent that is by making sure that money and currencies are stable in value so that people feel comfortable with the future value of what they're getting. So what China was basically doing is that if you have basically a very predictable exchange rate with the US, then that will allow businesses to feel comfortable engaging in transactions with various partners. And that's what they did. That is what allowed for economic activity to flourish. If you look at all the other places that were were forced to have, floating currencies, whatever, it was a disaster because these businesses couldn't establish any way of having stable, predictable businesses outside their own borders. And we've seen, with hot money, it is very disastrous to developing economies. So I would say that they're not a currency manipulator. They're actually trying to be very pro-capitalist this way by maintaining stable currencies so that that becomes a foundation for all other businesses to thrive. When you have floating currencies and volatility in currencies, the only beneficiaries of that are currency traders because they benefit from having arbitrage of currencies floating all over the place. No other business can benefit except the banks that do that. So guess who's the ones who've been saying that they want China off this? Because this would be the biggest opportunity for them to make money, is to trade against the Chinese yuan. And then they would basically bankrupt everybody else, and then the banks would be even richer than they are now.
Central planning at the government level plus market forces equals slightly competitive advantage. China, as you talk about the capitalism with Chinese characteristics. What can we take out of that? What can the U.S. Take out of that? What is a good prescription in terms of what does that look like for the U.S. if we were to? Is it longer term planning? Is it considering a? Yeah,
I mean, I think a lot of people here realize that our time frames are getting shorter and shorter, and I've heard the idea that we suffer from short-termism quite a bit in the U.S. now, given the 2-year election cycles, given that companies manage to quarterly results for Wall Street. There frankly is, not a lot of people thinking about the longer term consequences for the nation as a whole here. Of course, there are certain, special interest groups that can think about the long term, but only for their own long-term good and not necessarily for the whole society. So how do we protect the society and the society's long-term interests, given, all these other forces? And I suggest, here, how China's tried to combat this was that they've institutionalized this idea of a 5-year plan, which I would argue is not yesterday's your grandmother's 5-year plan, because I know people still think, oh yeah, it was a disaster under Mao, under, the old Soviet Union. I would say that today's 5-year plan is not about central planning anymore. It's only about goal setting. It's a goal setting exercise for them today because they don't control all the factors of production anymore and trying to manage that to goals. All they can do is say, this is our vision. We'd like to reach this point. And then they would set specific targets on these different areas. And then they would invite the entire private sector to help them reach it. So it's basically creating sort of the rules of the sandbox and then allowing all the creativity of entrepreneurs to help them reach these goals. So for instance, in the latest 5-year plan, they said they wanted a cleaner, greener economy. And so they would have specific goals there, such as we want to reduce carbon emissions by 17% per GDP unit. We want to increase building efficiency by 16% per GDP unit. And then once they set these goals in place, then for the next 5 years, the people who are responsible for these things, whether they're in the energy department or they're, governor of a province, then they have the freedom to create their own, tax incentives to green technology companies to invite them to come in, or they would hike taxes on dirty technologies and dirty industries. And this is how they would try to reach their goals and again, align incentives. And I would say the closest thing the U.S. has to this is the OMB budget, in which it's supposed to reflect the president's priorities in their spending every year. But the biggest difference is that this budget never has targets associated with them. We could allocate, money to Medicare, to the military, to whatever, and yet we never require them to deliver something in return. It becomes basically money, taxpayer money going into a black hole, where they don't have to show specific results in return for that money. And so I'm suggesting that this is like, again, back to the corporate model, a CEO giving money to a department that is, completely full of deadbeats who are not delivering anything. What CEO would do that? Well, if we actually put targets, maybe we are then aligning those government workers to do something what the taxpayers want. We could be driving more transparency. We could drive more accountability. These are not crazy ideas. This is just good common sense that we've seen done in the private sector, but we just need to apply it into the public sector. And this doesn't make it less democratic, it just means people are accountable.
Great. Any other questions before we go back to Steve? Yes, Steve.
I assume you accept the fact that the Chinese currency is undervalued. Do you accept that fact? If you don't, you're the only one in the world who does.
I would say that you can't just, the currency is
A simple
one.
yes or no. Is it undervalued or not?
I'm sorry, Steve. One
No, she's
question.
got to answer a question. She's avoided every
I'm
once
asking
of it. Is the Chinese currency undervalued in your mind?
I would say I don't know that. I would have to basically take all the other data into account because, and I will tell you this, when people try to focus on one thing, they're missing the bigger picture. It's just like saying, okay, green apples are cheaper at Safeway than they are at Whole Foods, so therefore we should only shop at Safeway. Well, frankly, there's so many other things that are on offer that people make their decisions of where they want to do their grocery shopping. That only being one of them. You've got, obviously labor wages, you've got other, quality control issues. I mean, there's so many things, healthcare, insurance. I mean, there's just so many different things that determine the competitiveness of one nation over another. Currency only being one of them, but if it is adjusted in a different way through super rising labor wages, which has been happening in China, which has the same effect as a rising currency. Because frankly, that is about how much is that product coming out of that country. And labor wages is a very big input into a lot of these things. So if that is rising by 20%, that actually is like the equivalent of the currency rising by 20%.
This might be a good time to segue into the epilogue, which does share what China can learn from America. And Anne cites respecting uniqueness, okay to fail, girl power, brand awareness, and justice for all. I'm wondering if, Anne, you can talk. I was particularly interested in the concept of girl power, and because there is some argument that in China there is quite a bit of opportunity for under the socialist government. But any of those topics that you want to share a little bit of your insight, and we can field some questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really interesting is that there are more women billionaires who are self-made in China than anywhere in the world, including the US, which kind of tells you how they have tried to spread the opportunity as equally as they can. And this is a developing country. We have to remember that this is a country that has 500 million people still living in complete poverty, and yet they've been trying to, adjust to a very modern world very, very quickly. And I'm saying that this is something that we should be recognizing as, you know, pretty extraordinary. And if they are able to if they are willing and able to make these changes to improve their nation, then so can the U.S. And in the last 30 years, I have to say, I've seen more improvement in China than I've seen in the U.S., and that's frankly no excuse, given that we are the wealthiest nation that has all the resources at its fingertips.
Any questions on what the U.S. can learn from China? Yes?
So I would ask you, I think your portrait is a little overdrawn about
And what China
Targets.
can learn from the U.S. road?
about management by objectives. We have the Government Performance and Results Act. We had the whole movement for reinventing government. The whole idea that government should not, perform all the tasks, but rather identify targets. This was the background of privatization. So there's been a great deal in the culture here about government having targets and goals. And I guess the way I would phrase the question is, I don't think it's that this exists in China and doesn't exist here, but I would ask you, how is it different in China than it is here? Since I'm sure you're as aware as I am that it's a very common notion here and a very active part of.
Well, I think that people can talk about it, and that it's quite a different thing to make it actually happen. It's just like a lot of politicians can promise the world, and yet they're not delivering a lot of things. And I'm saying that if you actually held them more accountable in terms of, their money, their ability to, well, obviously you can't get promoted here, but there has to be a way to hold them more accountable. And I think that's what I'm trying to find, the difference is that in China, they, if they just talk about it and don't deliver, then there are more consequences than it would be for a politician here. So, how that happens, definitely is in the details, and, I don't go into that. That's a concept that hasn't even been discussed, so you can't even build out a whole plan. Until people actually agree that that's an issue, then I think, then you go to the next level, like how you design that.
Can I follow that?
Sure.
I just understand the difference. So this election goes back and forth about a lot of things, but a lot of it is about one number, the unemployment rate, and whether the president, how accountable the president is for the current unemployment rate, and whether you're on the left or you're right, and people have criticisms about what he's done to do that. So how is that unlike China? And what is widely said here is he's going to. I don't think people are feeling it this week, but they had been feeling that he was going to win or lose on the basis of that number, that performance number. How is that different from the way it would be in China?
Well, that may be similar in some ways, but I was using examples of many other departments throughout the government, and there are hundreds of thousands of those jobs, right, that aren't necessarily being measured in this way. And even with the unemployment rate, we can see how there are already people saying even if it misses the number for Obama, the magic number, he still might win based on the fact that people just like him more than Romney, which has nothing to do with his performance and more about likability and personality. And so, and I'm not saying that this doesn't come into play in China. Obviously, personalities, connections, they all do, and China is not immune to these things. This is more about just big picture concepts of how we try to align incentives more. So I was basically more or less criticizing the idea of the plum book that we have, which I don't think is aligned to performance by any stretch of the word. Meaning, I know people who are running various organizations who were awarded these positions, and they don't have any targets that they're supposed to answer to.
Okay, right here.
My name is Ronnie Ron. I'm a social psychologist here, and I was very interested in the whole concept of girl power, and I'd like to know, is there a glass ceiling in China? And how did the culture evolve to allow so many women to become billionaires? Was it perhaps partially what they chose to focus in on? I mean, you know, were they individual solo entrepreneurs? Were they women who made it in the equivalent of a Goldman Sachs kind of environment? I mean, I would really like to hear what you have to say about
I mean, I think
the
it's,
girl power.
I mean, clearly there's still, we all know about the bias towards men and then having, you know, young sons as to daughters, right, during the whole one-child policy and all that. But I would say that China's culture and ability to embrace the sort of more equal opportunity for women came after the whole, you know, Cultural Revolution and all that, because it was basically about, you know, smashing old ideas and old cultural things that hold people back. And so that created almost more of a state of equality, a way of seeing, you know, everyone as comrades. So that kind of laid the cultural foundation for why I think people were more accepting of women rising up into high-level positions and making more money than, say, the Japanese, for instance, where the women are continually held back and treated like second-class citizens there. And you know, they developed far faster and earlier than China, and yet, you know, they don't have women
I
billionaires.
know, but there's
So-
many things going on with Japan that factor into that. I'm asking you specifically about China and how the culture evolved to allow, quote unquote, these women to succeed. I mean, that's a humongous change.
I agree. And that humongous change, I think, like I said, happened because when you have a cultural revolution where they were basically wiping out a lot of the established players and a lot of establishment thinking, then it wipes away a lot of the old prejudices. And that, I think, is what sort of cleared the way to allow for some of this. And I have to say, when I was teaching at Peking University, there were literally just as many women in those finance and economics classes as men. And in fact, you know, some of them were probably even smarter. I mean, these women are not held back by the old cultural biases because, I think, of that cultural clearing away before this whole rise. I think that helped.
May I ask you
One follow-up question, then one more question, and then we'll conclude and
for
we can
these
talk
women who were able
one-on-one.
to succeed given this foundation? In the United States, as you know, a lot of super successful women remain single, even though they might not like to be. Is that also true in China?
Yeah. Yeah, in fact, I don't think they even need the one-child policy because it's been true everywhere in the world. As women become more educated, they tend to stay single, they tend to not have kids, they tend to, you know, because they see that they can have a great life doing what they can do, and unfortunately, lots of times, in this day and age, it's still sort of a man's world, and so going up the corporate ladder or up government means you have to devote a lot of your time to a high-powered job and not necessarily have time to raise kids. So that actually is unfortunate, but that is something that I'm seeing there too.
Final question from the audience? Any question? Oh, okay, final question here and then I'll...
I was curious if you think that the U.S. can learn from China, and I guess I'm from Canada, and I'm wondering if China's perhaps their background, and maybe with more with like collective thought versus sort of U.S. is very like ruggedly individualistic. Do you think U.S. is open to learning from China, and could that be a factor in the?
Well, I actually disagree with the fact that we don't have some collective thinking going on here too.
Okay.
I mean, I think that it's clear that, you know, a lot of people can get easily manipulated to thinking certain things because frankly a lot of people are too busy working with their jobs or whatever to delve deeply into a lot of issues, and then we'll just hear whatever the first thing they hear out of on TV or something, and then that becomes defining for whatever their thoughts are. I think that it's probably going to be a long-term thing. I think that people tend to be resistant to what they don't understand. And then, especially in the U.S., where, we've been #1 for a long time, and then the idea of learning from someone else, from an upstart like China, just seems so, contradictory. So I think that also makes it tougher, especially when you are going through economic insecurity. When people are feeling insecure, then they become more defensive, and then therefore are less willing to admit that they need to learn something, right? It's always when you're strong, when you're confident, that you don't mind saying, hearing criticisms and whatnot. It's when you're not strong is when you're very resistant to criticisms, right? So this, I think, is a sensitive time for the U.S., given where we've been in the last decade or so. So I think it's going to be not an easy sell or transition, frankly, but, I think that I think that when people realize, the cost of doing nothing is probably worse.
Well,
Fast
thank you for
forward.
opening.
Fast forward to January 2013, and you're brought into the president's office. I was going to say new, I meant the president's office. And he says, I can do one thing that you prescribe from your book. And I can do one thing that you prescribe. What should we do in America from your prescription? What would you say?
I would suggest that we engage in more special economic zones, which I talk about in my book as China's answer to systematic experimentation of economic policy. Instead of just relying on rhetoric about different policies, I think you want to put them to the test. And not just in one state, but have them happen in various states to see if something works. And then systematically collect the data. We don't actually do a good job of that. We think that we have all this data, but frankly, I was in the Pew Research offices talking to the folks there who work on different studies. They agree with me. They said there is a complete lack of data that is scrubbed in the U.S. about economic policies. Oftentimes, a state or city or whatever will engage in something, but no one follows up to see if it really works as stated. There's no data collection on it. There's no post-mortem analysis done on any of this stuff. And then a lot of the things that they report, they're basically self-reported surveys, and no one even knows what the error rates are for a lot of these things and so forth. And so I would say that that is what we need more of, is really figure out what's really working in the U.S. and what's not.
Anne, Lee, thank you for your candid remarks. I think you've heated up this room a little bit from the right. Anne's going to join me in talking about a book about our history. And now I just found out today that Anne has a connection to the Yale-China Association. Her father is a graduate of New Asian College at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and New Asia and Yale-China have been partners for 60 years. And we helped establish the initial funding to establish New Asia 60 years ago. But this is a history book that may have your father's picture. But thank you so much, Anne.
Thank you.
Us in this lively conversation, and we'll stick around for 22 minutes to sign books. I recommend the book highly, and actually I have thank you. She included my praise for the book inside. I think it's a wonderful, objective, but very culturally sensitive publication, and it has parts that I haven't read in any other U.S.-China book. And then the next Fireside Chat, just for your information, is November 1, and we'll have a wonderful conversation with the Yale World Fellow from China, Wen Yuanhua, and he's the deputy president of the Tianjin branch of one of the largest public banks in China, China Construction Bank. So he'll join us then. But please stick around, have some coffee, have some tea. Thank you so much for joining us, and please